Welcome back to Worth the Effort Woodworking. This episode is part 2 of our introductory woodworking lesson, where we're going to go a lot more in-depth into dealing with wood's grain direction and chisel use, which, if you remember from last episode, is kind of an extension of all the other woodworking tools we have in our arsenal. Let's recap what we've learned so far. In the last episode, we talked about the peculiarities of wood, its strengths and weaknesses, and how tools had to adapt to those different features. We also covered some basic principles of sharpening as we went through the process of sharpening a 1/2-inch chisel. This is a tool we are going to use quite a bit today going through our exercise, as today's lesson delves deep into the interaction between wood and that cutting edge. Something you're going to have to think about every single time you make a cut in your woodworking career, even when it becomes second nature and you don't really realize you are making that analysis. Along the way, we're also going to talk about tool selection and how to make a good purchase, specifically with chisels. We do have a fun little exercise where we are going to do a little bit of letter carving. Now, some people might look at this and think it's a fairly simple project that will take you a half hour to 45 minutes, and that's true. But along the way, we can really analyze how the cutting edge is interacting with the wood. So even if you're an experienced woodworker, I suggest you just take out the time and have a little fun. Make yourself a little letter sign. Now, to do the project, we are going to need a piece of wood. You do want to get something a little bit longer. What I have right here is a 1x8 board. Really, it's about 7¼ inches as it comes from the store. And it is 16 inches long, so I can have a little bit of extra space on either side to clamp the work down to my workbench. Speaking of clamps, you really only need a couple of cheap clamps. But today you're going to see me using something called a holdfast. And I'll discuss the principles of how this works later in the video. You're also going to want a ruler and a pencil and eraser, and most importantly, you are going to want a sharp chisel, and we covered how to sharpen this in the last episode. I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch. I use that for pretty much everything in these videos that you see, but if you have something around that, that is okay. Just understand when I'm talking about laying out our letters, and I say leave at least a 1/2 inch so that you can get your chisel through, understand you're going to might have to leave a little bit more if you're using a slightly bigger chisel. You're going to want a mallet to hit it with, and as a luxury tool, if you want to not do as much mathematics, grab yourself a pair of dividers. I'll play around with them a little bit, but this isn't critical. So, are you ready to have a little fun? Let's get busy. Now, briefly, I want to talk about safety. Because in the woodworking world, I'm going to make you a guarantee. You are going to cut yourself. You are going to get abrasions. You are going to get splinters. As much as we protect ourselves, accidents happen. Nothing in life is risk-free. You can go out to the playground, fall down in the gravel pit, and skin your knee. You get out on the football field, you can twist your ankle. In art class, you can get a paper cut. There is risk in everything. Now, I am a big fan of Mike Rowe. I've never really seen his Dirty Jobs episode or stuff like that. I've gotten to know him through his talks, his discussions, his rants, and I'm a big fan of how he's been approaching safety, that safety third. Now, you might not believe in his marketing pitch, but you got to give him credit. People are talking about it, and his big aspect is people saying safety is first is somewhat of a lie. Because everywhere you go, you see that they have some risk involved. I would love for somebody to walk up to a soldier and say safety is first, when in reality, they have a job to do, and that job comes first. They use common sense to keep themselves as safe as possible, but they have a job to do. Same for policemen, same for firemen, same for craftsmen, same for teachers. They are trying to educate you, and they are keeping you in as safe an environment as possible, but there is risk involved if you're trying to teach somebody to use a chisel. Okay? You have to assume those risks yourself. Nobody else is going to protect you. And hanging around somebody waving a chisel is probably not the smartest thing in the world. Now, luckily, we've been provided with some armor to protect ourselves from the hazards of life. We as endoskeletal vertebrates are given skin. Exoskeletal people like bugs and Iron Man have this thick shell of armor to protect them, but we have skin, which is somewhat soft and malleable. But soft and malleable can be really strong. Hence, a lot of those samurai warriors use just layers of paper to protect them from slicing and striking blows. Skin is armor. It is designed to take abuse. This armor of ours is basically made of an outer layer called epidermis and an inner layer called dermis. And how they react to damage is why our cuts heal so quickly. I mean, basically, our skin is replaced or refreshed every 7 days. So if you were to accidentally cut yourself with something as sharp as a scalpel sharp chisel, well, that cut will heal fairly quickly. And that is because how the epidermis and dermis reacts to damage. The first state is what they call homeostasis, and that's when you're bleeding. And bleeding is not a bad thing, unless it's some kind of Monty Python-esque flesh wound. It might be a good idea to let it bleed for a little bit. Basically, that flushes out all the contaminants that might have gotten into the cut. And after a little bit of time, clean it off. This would be the time you might want to squirt it down with a little hydrogen peroxide and let it flush in water, and then put a little pressure on it until the bleeding stops. Then put a Band-Aid on it. After that, you enter into a quick repair stage where it might get a little bit inflamed, it might get a little bit puffy. That's actually a little bit of a good thing, because that is your white cells reacting to all the contaminants that have gotten in there. White cells are pretty big, and when they conglomerate around, you get a little bit of swelling. They also attract a little water to help flush things out. And then within a few hours, you get what they call proliferation, which is just rapid cell growth. Your skin starts growing to fill in the gap, which is why putting a Band-Aid on something like a cut is a good idea. Where if you have an abrasion, a scuff or something like that, you kind of want to leave it open a little bit so that rapid cell growth will fill up a little bit quicker and fill all the holes in your skin. By putting a Band-Aid on it and a slight amount of pressure, it closes the gap, and those rapid cells will just fill everything up really quickly and bind it together. Which is also kind of cool if you accidentally cut yourself with a sharp tool, not a dull tool. A sharp tool will slice, where a dull tool will serrate. That slicing action enhances quicker cell recovery. It makes your cuts heal faster. And this proliferation stage goes on until basically your scab falls off. After that, you reach a maturation stage, and that's where scars develop. You know, they start out pink because they're fairly thin, and then in about a month or two, they're fairly white. And if you have a bad cut, it might be a little bit mound. But maturation is a process that goes on for the rest of your life, which is why scars tend to disappear over time. Which, if you notice on your hands, you've probably gotten paper cuts before. Look for the scars. They're no longer there. They've practically disappeared because maturation is continuously going on. And that's what's so cool about your skin. But I need to tell you this. Protecting that skin, protecting your own skin is your responsibility. Keep yourself out of danger. I mean, you can look at an environment and see if it's dangerous or not. Sometimes you might have to take a small risk. In fact, like holding a chisel with two hands, there's still risk there, but it's diminished because we are using good techniques and we're thinking the thing through. Now, one last comment about safety. Inebriation in a wood shop is just plain idiotic. If you or anybody else are inebriated, even if it's just cough syrup, you should not be around sharp tools. It's just stupid. And anything bad that happens as a result of that is your fault, even if you aren't the inebriated person, because you put yourself in that environment. It is your responsibility to simply walk away. Now, today's ambitious goal is for us to have a full understanding of how blades interact with grain direction. And grain direction is basically the growth rings of a tree. The problem we have is trees are organic. They don't grow in straight lines. A lot of times they will taper out towards the roots, or maybe we might have an obstacle where a squirrel created a home. So the growth rings had to waver around. A lot of times you have tree branches so that the growth rings will curve over here. In my example piece of wood that I'm going to be using in this project, you look at these growth rings. They aren't straight because this tree, this board was actually taken from the center of a tree. kind of right to the side of it. So it basically has some growth rings that are coming straight down, others that are growing straight across. Coming down the front, they tend to wander around because this tree was thicker on bottom, so this particular board probably came from the bottom of a tree. When they took it out, they couldn't get a straight board coming all the way down. They kind of got it toward the center, so it kind of tapered in here, meaning the grain direction coming through the board is not straight. You'll notice sometimes you get a little waving in the grain direction. Maybe there was a tree branch that started and got knocked off, so there's a little wave in there. We don't really know, but the key thing is grain direction is not consistent in wood. So it's something we have to master its understanding so that we can get smooth surfaces. We can get straight boards. We have to deal with wood's peculiarities. Now there's a term you will hear in woodworking quite a bit. It's called working with the grain or going with the grain. And what they're talking about is taking advantage of wood's weaknesses or having to deal with wood's weaknesses. And if you remember, we talked about wood is very weak going with the grain. It tends to split out. So if you have grain direction coming down across a board, that board can be very weak coming this way and it will break along the grain. The problem we have is, what if we are planing and the grain is coming this way and we plane against that grain? It will tend to lift the fibers, thus splitting the wood ahead of the blade. What we talk about when we're saying going with the grain is basically we want to push the grain down as we go across it. So I would go this way and it would be laying those fibers down so that they compress and we slice them off. If we were to come back the opposite way, basically I would hit that point and the crack would develop going down. That's kind of what we call tear out or split. Another way I like to explain it to a lot of people is petting cats. We've all petted a cat, and if you pet a cat going from the head to the tail, basically laying their hairs down, they will purr and they like it and they enjoy that kind of stuff. But the moment you go from the tail to the head where you're lifting those hairs up, what do? They turn around and bite. They attack. They don't like that. Neither does wood. It likes to have those fibers laid down, not lifted up. In today's exercise, we're going to be using a portion of a 1x8 board that I just bought at a big box store. Just a piece of inexpensive pine that we can practice with. Now, I bought this 1x8, but if any of y'all are sitting in the classroom looking at it and say, hey, this ain't right, because it is not 1 inch thick, it's 3/4 of an inch thick, and it's not 8 inches across, it's 7 1/4 inches across. That's because when we buy lumber, we are not buying the nice, finished, smooth, squared up stuff. What you're actually doing is buying the first cut from the tree. Basically, they take the tree down, they saw it up into blanks, and those blanks might be 1 inch thick, or what we call 4/4 in the lumber industry, and 8 inches across. And then as that board dries, it's going to shrink a little bit. So after it's dry, it's a little bit smaller. And then before they send it to the store, they will plane it nice and flat for us. They will square one edge and then make this edge over here parallel, thus cutting off a little bit of the X side of the wood. So our 1 inch board gets shrinks, planes down, and then gets dressed so that we can use it. So they're saving us time. So in effect, when you're buying a 1x8 board, you are buying the board from the tree and paying for the services to make it nice enough for us to use straight from the get-go. If you go straight to the lumber yard, you can buy 4/4 material that hasn't been all dressed up, but it still has shrunk a little bit. But you can save a little money that way because you'll be doing the dressing yourself. Now this particular board is 16 inches across because I wanted a little extra space to clamp on the edge, and I also wanted to protect the edge. So I will cut it back to my final dimension after we carve our cool little symbol. Now in design, there's a general theory out there that we like to use whole numbers, whole ratios, and we're going to do that today. We are basically going to do a 2x3 ratio. So two across and 3 lengthwise. And that'll give us a nice box that looks correct. But here's the thing, we now need to do those measurements to draw out that diagram. So here's our math problem of the day. So, here's a quick diagram of my board. I know it is 16 inches long right now, but that's a little bit too long because, as I said earlier, I want a little bit of space on each end to clamp it down. our actual symbol is going to be in a box that we'll cut out at the end that'll have a ratio of 2 to 3. A good round ratio that will look good to us. Now, to figure that out, we have a bit of a math problem. We want our height to be 2 times 2 of our symbols, so I'm going to say that's going to be 2x. And then our width will be 3x. And that will give us a nice proportional box to put our symbol in. So we need to figure out x. The problem we have is the height of this is no longer 8. It's actually 7 1/4. If it was 8, basically x would be 4, because 2 divided into 8 is the 4. We now need to divide 7 1/4 into 2 parts to get our x. Now I'll give you a hint. 1/4 is the same thing as 2/8. I have faith that you can figure this math problem out on your own, because that faith is due to the fact that y'all are a lot more educated than those people in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century who basically did not have very much math skills, but they used proportions quite a bit. And here's how they did it without having to deal with a lot of math. So I have my board here. I have about 2 inches on either side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to establish a line, a straight line over here. So I'm going to come in about 2 inches on each side. And if this is a degree or 2 off, don't really worry about it. This is just practice, so we're not taking it too seriously. We're just here to learn a little bit. So I do my 2 diagrams out, and I just draw myself a straight line by connecting those 2 dots. No big deal. Okay? Now, how they did it is this is now 2x of what we want the length to be. So if we find x, we can go 3 times across and get our total length. So what they used to do is they take a pair of dividers. Dividers don't require much math, and I will change the setting up. So I'm going to set one line off, and then just walking down this line, I come over. And I come over here, you see I'm quite a bit over on this side. That error, because I made 2 steps, is twice my error. So I just cut that in half, divide it back down, and then I walk it across again. And it's a bit of trial and error. 1, 2. That error is twice my error, so I come back about halfway. I walk it across again. 1, 2. Now this point is on the very other side. So I've now found the center of this board right here. And thus, this divider is set to x. So now all I have to do is put it down here on the line and walk it off 3 steps to get my 3x. 1, 2, 3. And make a little indentation. Come back to the top, mark that off 3 steps. 1, 2, 3, and make a little indentation. And then all I have to do now is take my pencil into that indentation and connect the 2 dots. And I now have a 2 to 3 ratio. The next step we want to do is we want to create a border so that this becomes somewhat of a frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in 1 inch all the way around. And I'll just mark that out with my ruler and connect the dots. No big deal. Anybody can do this kind of stuff. Remember, the guys that were doing this back in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, most of them were not overly educated. So they just learned these tricks to do some really cool geometry without having to know a lot of math. Now, they understood the principles behind it, they just might not have known the arithmetic. So we now have a nice picture frame. We also want to come in about 3/4 of the way in on both sides, and maybe another inch from either side, and that'll give us a box to lay out our symbol. So what I now have is basically a picture frame, and then I'm going to put a symbol. I'm going to use one of my initials in this middle section, and all the stuff around here will be recessed. The reason why I came in 3/4 of an inch here to recess is because I'm using a 1/2 inch chisel. So I wanted to have room for that chisel to move around. If you're using a 3/4 inch or 1 inch chisel, you might have to give yourself a little bit more room. Okay, this is where you get to have a little bit of creative fun. You get to design the symbol you're going to be put in. I'm going to give you a few hints. Don't make it overly complex. Remember, we're all kind of at the kindergarten level of woodworking, so this is going to be the equivalent of a crayon drawing your mom would put on the refrigerator. Don't take it too seriously. We're just learning this. But we have our board right here. We have the center section. We have a raised area that's going to be our frame. Then we have a lowered area that's going to reveal the pop-up letter. And then we have a center square, and that's where our letter is going to go. When you design it, though, you need to take into a few considerations. Remember, wood is very weak going with the grain, so it will tend to split going with the grain. So what you don't want to have is a very thin section up top. My letter is going to be a letter G, so I'm going to basically have it fairly thick on the top and bottom, and I'll let it get thin on the sides. So as I come down, I'll let it get thin on the sides, but keep it thick on the top and bottom. That way, I don't have to worry about the grain breaking as much. You'll have a little bit more strength. Not much, but we are beginning, so if we get a little bit more rambunctious than we meant to, we don't want it to break apart. But if it does, who really cares? It's just a learning exercise, and just hold on to any piece that breaks off that you wanted to keep, and we can glue it back on if we really wanted to. So have fun, design a letter. It would be best if it combined both straights and curves, so you'll get a good learning experience, but just do what you want there. And when you're done, I just erase any lines that I'm not going to be using, just to reduce the possibility of confusion. So now we're going to start doing some chopping. In the chopping, you're going to be using a chisel and a mallet. Okay? Now, when you are chopping and carving and stuff like that and doing intricate work, the proper way to hold a chisel is way down by the end. Because I want you to think about it. How many of y'all sign your names holding the pencil at the end like this? It's very hard to control if you're holding it way out there. A chisel is very hard to control the tip when you are up on the handle. So what you do is you hold it down low, and then you can strike the handle. And the handle striking area is a lot bigger than the edge of the chisel. So more control at the edge, less up top. Now what we're going to do is we're going to strike straight down, going across a grain. Just like in the first episode, we could hit it as hard as we wanted if we had the bevel going across the grain. And I'm going to lay the chisel down. Now what's going to be happening is I'm not really going with or against the grain, I'm going through it. And I'm wanting to go straight down. So I'm just putting it on the line, the grain is running up and down, I'm giving it some strikes. But the problem I have right now is the way I've had my board selected. It is very hard for me to tell if this chisel is going straight up and down if I'm looking at it this way. It is very hard to tell, easy to tell if it's straight up and down if I'm going side to side. So the best thing for me to do would just to turn the board. Now when I chop, I can visualize going straight up and down. Hold the chisel down low and give it a few medium strikes. Now you could hit this pretty much as hard as you wanted, but we don't want to go down too far deep, because that'll just mean more wood we have to remove when we recess it. And I'm just working my way across, following that line. If you're a little bit off, don't worry about it. It's just an exercise and we're just learning. But as you do this, since we're dropping it right out on the line, I want you to notice what's happening with the blade. It's actually not staying in the spot you put it. Because a chisel is not an equilateral triangle, meaning the angle is not the same on both sides, there's more pressure on one side of the blade than the other, so it will tend to move towards this flat side a little bit. So you can lay it right down on that line, but the moment you strike it, it kind of moves back a little bit. Go ahead and finish chopping a straight line on the top and bottom, and then come back. Now we're going to go ahead and chop the lines going up and down with the grain. Now this is where things get kind of dangerous, because if you remember in our first episode when we took the chisel, we put it along with the grain and we gave it a few strikes. What happened? The wood split. It blew apart. That's because wood is very weak going with the grain. So we have to take into consideration a little bit of touch, because we are going to be chopping with the grain. We can't chop too hard so that the wood compresses so much that it develops enough pressure to split itself. The other thing we have to take into consideration is now we have to deal with grain direction. This board right here, the grain does not run straight through. It kind of runs at a slight angle. So let's see what happens when we start chopping very lightly, going with the grain, and see if it splits ahead of the cut. So if you notice, the grain on this board is moving ever so slightly in this direction. Okay, I'm exaggerating because I have to look down the whole board. So I'm going to lay my chisel right on that line, and just like when we went across the grain, the wood fibers are going to compress. But I want you to see if you can pay attention to the spot right in front of the blade right here. I want you to notice that it will split ahead of it. In fact, I'm going to come over here into the waist so that you can see it a little bit better, because that pencil line might cover it up. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to give it a few light taps. Here we go. Now, I'm going to show you a quick picture of this exact thing, and you can see that the wood is splitting in front of the blade. You can even see it in front of the blade right here, where it split into the gap that we created when we went across grain, because the wood was very weak there. Now this grain, again, is running kind of this direction. So the thing is, I don't want to start up at this corner, because I don't want the grain to split into the wood I want to save. I want it to split into the wood I want to get rid of. So if I were to start at the bottom edge and come up, anytime that split happened, it would be going off into my waste wood. So even when we're slightly chopping, we have to take into consideration the grain direction so that we can preserve the nice wood that we want to keep. So I'm going to chop this starting at the bottom of the board and work my way up towards the top on this side. But on the other side, because the grain is still running this way, I want to start at the top and work my way down so that the split constantly goes into the waste wood. And I'm not hitting very hard because I do not want this board to break apart. Go ahead and chop your way all the way down the sides. Oh, one of the reasons I kind of like carving mounts versus the more traditional Thor-style joinery mounts is because in a situation like this where I need to make a light cut with a lot of control, I don't hold it by the handle. I can hold it up on the head of the mallet. That way there's not much leverage involved in the strike. Leverage adds power. I can actually control the weight a little bit more better by just tapping it, holding it by the mallet head. Okay, now we're getting the fun part. We made the outline all along the outside, and you had to really focus when you were doing the up and down one, a lot more than doing the across the grain, because the across the grain can take a lot of abuse. But when you're going with the grain, because wood is very weak going with the grain, we really had to take precautions. Analyze where it was going to fail, and let it fail into the waste side of the wood. Now we're going to be doing our letter, which is a little bit more important than the border. The border can be all messed up. We want our letters, our symbols, to look really good. Now, I have a letter G here. I chose a G because it has straights and it has curves. So I had to take into consideration the same things I was talking about when I'm going across the grain and with the grain on the straights. But now with the curves, I have to take into the added consideration that at sometimes it's going to be going across grain, and sometimes it's going to be with grain, and sometimes it's going to be a bit of both. So I have to analyze which way might it crack, and if it will crack, I want to make sure it's going to go into the waste side. It's going to require a little bit of thought for y'all when you're doing this. Now we do have straight blades, so don't worry about that one. We will smooth it out. As we're doing it now and you're just chopping along, it's going to look more like an 8-bit character in a video game. Kind of blocky, but that is perfectly okay. Think of it as a Minecraft letter until we smooth it out at a later process. Now, as you're doing that, I do want you to have a second thought going on. I want you to analyze the chisel you're using. I want you to think about its shape. Does it have shoulders? Are those shoulders even all the way down? Think about the bevel. Is it completely flat on back, or is there some kind of design feature that raises it up a little bit so you can't keep it completely flat? Is the blade bent a little bit? Are these features there to enhance the experience, to enhance function, or are they there to ease manufacturing? Analyze that, and we're going to talk about this afterwards. And I want you to just have some thoughts in your mind of why your particular chisel is that way, and you can look at what we discussed and see if it's good or bad, or what you might want to change on it in the future if you buy another one. Oh, and one thing, you will notice that as you're chopping around, you want to keep the flat to the side you want shape so you get a nice ledge. If you have the bevel to the inside, you'll get it kind of sloped, and we want that nice crisp edge. So you'll have to rotate your chisel around to keep that flat on the corner, but just something else to think about. Also, notice how you have to change the power of your strike. When you're going with the grain, just like when we were doing the edge, we got to lower the impact. But as you start going across a grain, you can start picking up the power you're using to go down to the same depth. And when you're going straight across the grain, it'll pretty much take a pretty solid whack. Just work your way around. Use what you learned when you were doing the perimeter for doing the letter on the center. Okay, up until this point, you've seen that I've just been moving this around because all our force was going straight down. It was a safe operation to use non-clamp down. Now we need to clamp it down because we are going to be using force sideways, and we don't want this thing to be moving around. Now you can use just traditional hand clamps, but I'm going to use something called a holdfast. And what I have in my bench top are 3/4 inch holes. These holes are actually a tad bit thicker than this holdfast. The reason why they call it holdfast because it will slide into the hole, and if you notice, because it is loose here, whenever I have it fully seated, it is actually touching on the top here and on the bottom on the opposite side. So it kind of wedges it in. Then when you strike it, I want you to notice this pad doesn't move, and it doesn't move here, but the whole thing compresses, thus forming a spring. So this holds it down pretty good. You put 2 holdfasts on either side, and you've got this board clamped down very, very nicely. So now what I want you to do is holding the chisel in 2 hands. The back hand is going to provide direction. You can do an underhanded grip or overhanded grip, and the front hand is going to provide propulsion. Another thing the front hand is going to do is actually it's going to pull back a little bit, so there's tension in between these 2 hands, and that'll keep it nice and solid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this chisel about 1/4 inch back, and I'm going to lift it up at about 30 degrees. Then I'm just going to push down. You can wiggle it. You don't want to push too far. And I'm going to take out these little triangles. I'm just going to go all the way down the top of the board. You can pause the video now and get this done for yourself on your own. Now you're going to notice me switch to the bottom. Please notice, I'm just going to switch hands. This is something when you're working with hand tools, you need to get used to being somewhat ambidextrous. This is not an overly complex thing. It's not like writing letters or writing your signature. All you're doing is holding and pushing, maybe a little direction. So you can try both hands. Just lock it down, lift it up to about 30 degrees, and kind of wiggle it towards the base, or push towards the base. Now I want you to notice what's happening here. We are actually slicing the wood. Notice we are making nice, clean cuts. No tear out, very easy to do. This is because we are going with the grain. We are actually laying the cell fibers down. Remember, going along the side, even though the grain was waving quite a bit, at that 30-degree angle, we are pushing the cell fibers down. We are not lifting them up. So you get an extremely clean cut. Now I want you to come over, and this is where, once again, we have to be very careful, because we are going with the grain this time. We are splitting the wood. So you're going to come back about that 1/4 inch, using your front hand to both direct it and kind of pull it back a little bit so that you just don't plunge all the way through the board. And then just take nice, easy strokes. Now I want you to notice what just happened here. Can you see how the fibers split ahead of the wedge? That's because once we developed a little pressure from this cutting edge, this chisel turned into a wedge and is separating it out. Luckily, we've severed the fibers along this way so that the crack doesn't continue too far. I might consider coming out in a little bit farther, but I'm just going to slowly let it crack its way down in the waste part of the wood. Now, another thing we can try is we can actually slice it, see what happens. So I'm going to put this corner down and using my hand just kind of run it along and slice that wood off. Notice, once again, it is cracking ahead of the wood, so the grain is wanting to go that way. So I'm coming along, slicing the corner out. Taking advantage of the weakness of the wood. Another thing worth trying is I'm going to look down at the side of this board, and I notice that the grain is kind of going uphill this direction. So if I were to come in at this angle, I would be laying those fibers down. So what I could try to do is turn the chisel, bevel down, put a corner in the side over here, and just try and plane out that corner. Just take it nice and smooth. Okay, so far we've made a little V-cut to start the recessing of both the border along the top and along the side. And you got to experience what it was like to cut down with the grain, going across the grain downsize, and then having to deal with grain direction when we came across the top. I think most of y'all would agree that it was a lot easier to plane it, going with the grain in one smooth stroke, than it was to kind of split it, going along the grain using the wedge of the chisel. And that's something you experience quite a bit in woodworking, is to avoid the splitting action, you have to change direction or use a blade along its flat to plane along with it so that you avoid splits. Now we've got the hard part. We've got to do the interior, which includes curves. So let's take a closer look at the grain and how we're going to approach it to cut it out. What we have up here with the G is basically we have a section that's going to be just like this top section, where I could literally just take the chisel, put it in the end grain, and kind of slice it down to the V section. Just do it just like we did the end grain up here. But then we come out to this section along the side. Now I want you to notice that the grain is running like this. If I were to take my chisel and come up the wood this direction, like we were doing on the curve, it would want to split ahead of the wood. It gets very hard to cut. It doesn't want to deal. You can see right here, it is splitting up ahead of the wood. It doesn't seem to work that way. The best thing to do would be to come down with the wood and slice it. That way, if it does break off, it's breaking off towards the grain, and I can actually do the chiseling. And also, this is somewhat of a planing cut. And you'll notice that because I went with the grain in here, it is a lot smoother. So now we want to go ahead and cut out a little V along this whole edge around here. And I want you to experiment. Don't worry about if the grain splits out. Just kind of experiment. Oh, I'm getting splitting action here. Maybe I need to come the other way. Coming on the inside versus the outside, how is it different? Just kind of carve it along. Try changing your hand position. Don't be afraid of going against yourself. And just chisel it all out. We want a nice little V all the way around our letter. Please remember though, this is just a learning exercise. Mistakes are a good thing because you get to learn what to do, what not to do next time. Also, while you're doing this, just like the last time when we concentrate on the shape of the chisel and the metal portion, I want you to think about the handle, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. Is it plastic? Is it oblong? Is it round, or does it have flats on it? Think about that design, because at the end of this video we are going to talk about tool selection. What makes a good tool, what makes a bad tool, or a less desirable tool. There is really no such thing as a totally bad tool. You can use most tools for everything, just some are better suited than others for certain tasks. Okay, now that you have a small V outlining the frame and your letter, I want you to repeat the process all over again. Go ahead and chop your frame, going across the front, the sides. Chop the letter all over again, and then do these V cuts, because we want it to go about 1/4 of an inch in to give you a good 3D effect. Plus the fact that the first time we did it, you're just experimenting. You're trying the blade different ways. You're chopping different ways. This time it will clean up all your other marks that you did last time. And make it a lot smoother, and you'll get a little bit more experience, so your hand control will be better and you'll get smoother cuts. Now while you're doing that, I want to begin our discussion on tool selection, or how to choose a good quality tool without investing too much money, because you don't have to if you don't want to. Having luxury tools are nice, but a good $10 to $15 chisel will serve you for a lifetime. And specifically, I am going to talk about chisels today because that's the tool we are using. Now chisels are basically just a hunk of steel on a piece of wood, so the first thing we need consideration is steel. And steel has to be one of the coolest inventions mankind's ever come up with, because it is infinitely variable. We can make steel that's really hard and brittle, or something that's malleable and soft, and what's amazing about it is we can do that without changing its composition. Its same properties of iron, carbon, silica, and other little trace elements. We don't change that, but we can still make it, transform it from something hard to something somewhat soft and malleable. And how we do that? Basically we do it with heat. Now I want you to picture this. All those movies you've seen the blacksmith in. He's out there, he's making a sword, he sticks it in the fire, he gets it red hot, he brings it over his anvil, he bangs on it. When he bangs on it, you see those sparks fly out. Well, if you see those sparks fly out, basically it is a high carbon steel. A tool steel, that's what we like as woodworkers, because it can hold a very fine edge. That's where that carbon comes into effect. And those sparks are carbon being expelled out. Well, he bangs on it, he makes it the shape he wants, and then one of the last things he does, he sticks it back in the fire, and he shakes it around. He gets the air going in, fire's coming up. He gets it yellow hot, not red hot, yellow hot. And then what's he do? Well, because it's a movie, generally you see him take it over and dip it in a barrel of water. But in real life, a lot of those blacksmiths use oil, so you get a little fire coming up, which is why actors use water. Fire and actors don't mix. Anyways, what he's doing is he's creating a thermal shock to that steel. And it's kind of like if you're out in a 110-degree heat day and you go out to Barton Springs in Austin, which is a constant 68 degrees year-round, and you jump in, what's the first thing you do? You quench up. You get really tight. Well, that's exactly what the steel is doing. It's going into a crystalline structure they call martensite. Now, steel has a lot of strange terms out there. Austenite, martensite, ferrite, cementite. All these are basically terms of the different states of steel it's in. It's kind of like Eskimos and snow. We look out there, we see snow. They see slushy snow, hard snow, flowing snow, all that kind of stuff. So they have different terms for all those different snows. Well, steel is the same way. The guys that are really into it have lots of different terms for their state, even though snow's just frozen water and steel's just iron, carbon, and some other minute chemicals. Anyways, back to that blacksmith. He gets it red hot and he quenches it. And those crystalline structure that forms because it seizes up, that thermal shock, well, basically when you have a crystalline structure, all the compounds are very angular. And what's cool about that is when you have those angulars, there's lots of contact area between those compounds, unlike a ball or something where they're only touching in a point. And because there's lots of contact factor, there's a lot of stiction in between the chemicals. So they become very, very hard. But they are very brittle also because once those two straight contact points separate, there's very little holding them together, so then they break apart. And that's where that steel is after it's been quenched in that water. That thermal shock seizes it up. That right there does not make a very good chisel. That right there is the state a file is in. Extremely hard. You can use a steel file to cut other steels that have been softened a little bit, because the hardness of this will break the softer steel. How do you make steel softer? Well, that blacksmith will take that sword out of the water and he'll stick it back in the fire and shake it a little bit. And basically what he's doing is he's heating it back up to just about 350, 375, 400 degrees to soften it just enough so it's not as brittle anymore. It'll take a hit with another sword in battle. Well, we need to soften steel up enough so that we can abrade it and sharpen it. Because this file, you would never be able to put an edge on it. It's just way too hard. It'd actually destroy the diamonds on my sharpening stones. I need to soften it, and I can do that by sticking this very file in the toaster oven at about 350 degrees and leave it there for about 4 hours and let it cool down slowly after that. I could go put an edge on it, sharpen it, and use it as a chisel. Easy peasy. But that's why we have to take into consideration the steel and the hardening aspect when we start shopping for chisels. Most chisels are rated on what they call an RC scale, and woodworking tools are generally between 58, which is on the softer side, and 62, which is on the harder side. The harder the tool steel is, the longer it's going to hold its edge, but it's also going to be a lot harder to resharpen it. The softer it is, it's going to dull a little bit quicker, but it's easier to sharpen. Personally, I kind of like a slightly softer chisel because I don't mind sharpening and spending 30 seconds to maintain an edge. It's not that big a deal, and a lot of times I will use leather, as I showed you last episode. So, the first thing we need to do is find out what kind of hardness we prefer, and then go to the manufacturers that make that. And you can find that out via the website. They don't really put that information on the packaging if you're smart. But some manufacturers do, and they're trying to trick you into thinking it's a better tool. For example, I have a Fat Max right here, and what do they say right on the cover? 50% stronger. Well, doesn't that mean it's just going to be 50% harder? So it's going to be 50% harder to sharpen? What's the likelihood you're ever going to get an edge on this thing? Here's another tool I think is hilarious. A 4-in-1 tool. It's got a rasp, it's got a file, it's got a chisel, it's got a splitter, and then it's got a round rasp on it. Well, based on what we just learned, this steel is either hard enough that that rasp will stay sharp for a while and we will never put an edge on the chisel, or the rasp and file and the edge and all that kind of stuff is soft enough that it's going to go dull instantly and we can use it as a chisel. Unfortunately, they put the rasp on the backside, so you'll never be able to use it as a chisel, because once you smooth it out with a chisel blade edge, the rasp roughs it up in the back. I think this is another joke, but this is one of the better sellers at Home Depot. So, when you're looking for chisels, just do a little research in the steel they use. Now, quite commonly, you see two main kinds of steel in chisels. They call them O1 tool steel, which is oil quenched tool steel, and that's basically a high carbon steel. Then you have the A2 style steel, and those have a few more chemicals. The advantage of the A2 is they tend to hold their edge a little bit longer, but they're just as easy to sharpen. The disadvantage is the bevel angle. You can't quite get it down to the 25 degree, 20 degree range, because then the edge becomes kind of brittle because of the compounds they use. Where the O1 tool steel, you can drop down to that lower angles and it'll still stay very sharp fairly well. But at the higher angles, it doesn't hold its edge as well as A2. And you find that O1 tool steel, true O1 tool steel, tends to rust really, really quickly. Which is why a lot of manufacturers have gotten into the habit of adding chrome vanadium into steels. In fact, this one chisel right here was my go-to chisel for about a decade. I had no issues with it at all until I started doing some investigation and trying out some more chisels. Now, when you add chrome vanadium to steel, basically you make stainless steel, which doesn't oxidize or rust as much. Well, could you see why a manufacturer would like that? You put a chisel in a package, you want to batch out a trillion of these at one time for the production run for efficiencies, and then just leave them in storage for 5 or 10 years and sell them as you pull them out and sell them as you need them. Well, if it's sitting in the package turning black because of oxidation of the O1 tool steel, it'll be worth less money once it hits the showroom if it's sitting next to a nice shiny one. That's just how people are. Personally, me, I'll look at that black tarnishing that you see in some packaging, like this little Australian-made one, and go, oh my gosh, there's finally a high carbon tool steel. I want to buy that one. I can remove the tarnish easily. I'm going to get really good steel. The problem with chrome vanadium into it is it gets the compound bigger, so it can't quite get as good an edge, and the edge tends to soften up a little bit more, so it dulls a little bit quicker. And this is something you can feel when you sharpen it, because as I sharpen this particular chisel, which has a lot of chrome vanadium in it, it feels more like an eraser versus a high carbon steel, which would feel like the lead of a pencil. It's just a little bit gummier. It still will cut good. I mean, this is not a bad chisel. It just has its function. And if you are using it in a very humid environment, you're sweating on it all the time, hey, maybe you want a chrome vanadium just so it'll stay not looking nice. I mean, it does have its advantage, but the cutting edge is what I'm generally concerned with, and it doesn't quite work as well as just a straight high carbon steel. Now, there is a new caliber of steel out there that I'm really excited about. We've been using it in the turning world for quite a while, but it's just now coming into the hand tool world, and that's that powdered metal stuff. And basically, it's just a better way of mixing the iron and carbon so it's more uniform before they cook it, melt it all together. And what it gets is a very uniform structure, so it tends to hold its edge for an extremely long time, and yet it's still very easy to sharpen. The downside is, it's a lot more of a manufacturing process, so you're going to spend quite a bit of money on it. To me, that right there, the PMVs, 11s, and other powder metals out there, they're a bit of a luxury item at the moment. I'm sure prices will come down eventually, but sometimes it's nice to hop behind the wheel of a Ferrari just to drive it around. And I do have one of those chisels at the moment, and that's my go-to chisel that you've seen me use all day long. Well, there you go. You should have a recess of your cymbal and the interior of the frame by now. And if you did it right, if you look at some of the shavings, a lot of them are going to be long and straight because you took advantage of the weakness of the wood and you planed along with the grain, laying those cat hairs down so you can get nice continuous shavings that didn't split out. Now we want to concentrate on removing the waste to lower the background of everything but the cymbal. And we're going to do something that a lot of old books tell you never to do. We're going to go across the grain. Woo! No, really. Most people tell you to always go with the grain when you're planing along the grain path. Now, my thinking is, well, we know wood is weak along the grain, so why not take advantage of it and just break out big chunks of wood and not have to go through thousands and thousands of layers of thin chunks. Let's just get rid of the big stuff first and then smooth it out afterwards. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go across the grain, taking advantage of the weakness of the wood. But even in that situation, we have to talk about grain direction, because going across the grain assumes that this tree was flat when it grew, and it wasn't. It was round. I've inked in the grain pattern of the wood, and you can see the center of the tree was probably about right there, and it grew around like that. So if I want to make sure I lay those cat hairs down, I've got to come in from this direction to push the fibers down as I chip them off. That way, if there is a split, it splits towards my waist, towards the air. It's not going to split down into the wood. My problem is, I get about halfway and all of a sudden that tree's growth rings reverse down, and now this side is going against the grain. So then I'd have to come back that way. And what you'll find out is that even throughout the board, that might change. I might come in a little bit, and then all of a sudden I notice, hey, it's starting to split. Let's come back the other way. So, for the next few minutes, I want you to start clearing out as much of the waste as possible going across the grain. And you've got to look at your board and decide which way you're going to be laying those fibers down and which way you're going to lift them up and causing a split. And if you do start getting a split, hey, stop. Pull the chisel out, come in the other direction. Now I'm going to reclamp this one down. I do suggest you have it clamped down, and this would be a good time to use your mallet. When you're going with the grain, this particular pine that I got is fairly soft. I'm just doing this with a little hand pressure, but I can actually feel right when the grain starts to reverse on me and I need to start coming the other way. So I'll just go part of the way one way and then come back and go part of the way the other way. And my goal is to lower the background down to the bottom of my V-cuts in the wood. Now when you get to the point where you're down to the depth you want, you can actually find the bevel on your tool and start rocking off of that bottom bevel so that you can plane it smooth. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. I'm finding a certain depth, and then I'm lowering the handle angle to find a pivot point to get the angle I want, to get the flatness I want. Now, quick safety lesson. How smart would it be if I had a bunch of debris on my work that's getting in the way of me seeing it, to just take my hand and smooth it across, brush it off? That'd be a very easy way to get a pretty bad splinter. In woodworking, when you're working on a workbench, you never want to slide your hand around to move away material, debris. You could have a small splinter on your bench, or you could have enough shavings that you have a chisel hiding underneath, and you just get yourself. So you always want to use either another board to sweep stuff off, or I like keeping a little brush around to brush stuff off and get it on the floor. And in a wood shop, the floor is the trash can, because you're going to have to sweep up at the end of the day anyway, so might as well put it on the floor. Then just get back to work. Now, does yours look as bad as mine? All gnarled up and splintery and all that kind of stuff? Well, that's perfectly okay, because all we were doing is taking advantage of the weakness of the wood to get rid of the majority of it. You will notice that I could not remove the wood along the sides because I couldn't get my chisel in to go sideways, so I had to leave that for a little bit later on. But I could get most of the waste out of the material, even though it looks really messed up, all through here, and I got it down to the baseline of my little triangle. So now we're going to start going with the grain. And just like whenever we were working with the other side, going across the grain, I now have to contend with the grain direction here. It starts and it kind of wavers a little bit, but it ends up a little bit lower over here. So the overall grain direction is a downward slope with variations during the board. So I might be planing along this way and I start to get a little tear out, a little splintering, a little cracking. I need to stop and come back the other way. And basically this time I am going to be riding the bevel, so to speak. I'm using the bevel of the chisel to keep a flat all along. So this angle of the handle will stay the same, and as long as that bevel stays on the wood, it should maintain itself as pretty flat. So let's try going with the grain along the tree path and smooth out in addition to getting rid of the rest of the waste. Are you noticing how much smoother the wood is coming out when you're going with the grain versus across the grain? You're not getting as much tear out and stuff like that because you're laying those fibers down. You're slicing them off. You're petting the cat from head to tail and not coming back up. It really does make a difference. So go ahead and finish up going all the way across this, going with the grain, and then we'll come back and we'll work on the corners and stuff like that. Now, while you're working on that, let's further our discussion on tools. Specifically, now we're going to talk about chisel shape. I'm going to limit my talk to bevel edge chisels because that's kind of what most people are going to be getting in this modern day world. There are stuff like vintage firmer chisels and carving chisels and gouges and stuff like that. But for just a general all-around, knock-around, good woodworking tool, a bevel edge bench chisel is probably the way to go and where most of y'all will go. Now this right here is a Marples blue chip chisel, and they started making these in the 60s and made them all the way through the 70s and maybe I think the early 80s. Then Marples got bought out by Irwin, and Irwin started making this style, which is almost the same exact style. Everything's the same except for the handle is a little bit darker blue, which is the Irwin company colors. The steel is chrome vanadium steel. And the whole chisel is a different shape, which means it may look like the old ones, but it isn't. See, Irwin is capitalizing on the excellent reputation that these old Marples have. They call them Marples blue chips. These had high carbon tool steel in them with just a tad bit of chrome vanadium in them, but not much at all. They were very well made. They had nice narrow tapers on the side. And having a narrow taper on the side is critical, especially if you're doing stuff like dovetailing. Because if you have a thick shoulder on the side, you will never be able to get the chisel into these tight corners. And you can always tell somebody that has used a chisel like this or this to cut a dovetail, because right in that very inner corner is a little ledge where the fibers have been compressed into a tiny square in the corner. It's not a big deal and it doesn't affect the functionality of the joint, but it is something to take into consideration. Now, whenever Irwin bought them, they added a little bit more chrome vanadium to it to get it closer to stainless steel. I don't think this is a true stainless steel because of the percentages they use, but it is awfully close having worked with it. Now, this was my go-to chisel for over a decade. This is pretty much all I used. And having said that, I had no want for anything more high-end than this during all that time. This served my needs wonderfully. And if this is what you have, don't think twice about not using it or getting something better. This is a good quality chisel. But whenever I opened this little school, instead of just buying what I own, I did a little research and tried out several different other items. I bought some other knockoffs of the blue chips. These right here, and these are very common. A lot of manufacturers make this style of looking chisel simply because the old Marples had such a great reputation. I also bought some of the modern day Stanley ones, and I bought one from Czechoslovakia. I ended up going with this Czechoslovakia one, and I think you will see why in a second. If you look at the edges of all these chisels, you will notice that pretty much all of them have a taper on the edge. The bevels taper up so that the side bolsters get bigger and bigger and bigger the higher they go. I can't see any functional reason why that is there, other than the fact that maybe if somebody opening up a paint can and really have to leverage against it, it might add a little bit of strength. It does add a lot more metal to the chisel, which you would think would add cost to it, but I have a feeling they're actually saving money in the manufacturing. Because if you have a decent sized taper on the side, when they get these things red hot and then stamp them, almost immediately that metal starts to cool, and when that metal cools, it shrinks so slightly. So having that taper there will mean that this chisel will release out of the mold and they can just lift it up. If you had no taper whatsoever, more than likely that chisel would get stuck in the mold and you'd have to have a lot more force to get it out of the mold. So having that taper there, in my mind, is probably a way to save money in the manufacturing process. at which point they just lightly sand the bevel to make it look like it was ground. Now, some of the modern day versions, this is supposedly a remake of the old Stanley 750. They're making modern day 750, except they're using more modern metals. A little bit chrome vanadium in there, but I believe this is an A2 tool steel. I'm not 100% sure. But once again, they've got that taper in it. Just a little bit more manufacturing. Now, all of these are hardened to within a couple points of each other, so hardness isn't a factor in things. Once you get into the price range of, $15, you should be okay most of the time. Now, this Czechoslovakian chisel, and I'm not a salesperson for them. The reasons why I bought it is if you look at the side of it, they have spent extra time in the manufacture process to grind down the bevel so it's very narrow and it is even all the way down. With this tool, I can actually slide it into gaps farther, and I don't have to worry about the side bevel raising. Now, the downside is there is less metal in the chisel, so I can actually flex it a little bit. But I use that to my advantage when I'm trying to smooth multiple parts out. Now, the thing about this company right here is they made a huge investment in their metallurgy department and how they heat treated it. And all these other chisels right here use that type of heat treating that I explained to you, where they heated it red hot, they quenched it, and then they reheated it up to anneal it to soften it, so that they had several steps. This company has a system where I think they call it isothermic heating, where they make it red hot to shape it, then they do all the grinding, but while it's hot so it's easy to mold, and then when they quench it in a molten salt, not water, not oil, a molten salt, which means that it doesn't warp the metal as much. There's less grinding after the fact. You get higher quality tolerances. There's almost zero rejects when you do that one, according to their thing. So they save money on that aspect. And then they could take that money they saved and reinvest it into shaping the handle. I really do like the shape of this handle, and I fell in love with the metallurgy after I used it for a while. When you buy a brand new chisel, the bottom millimeter or two is generally kind of crap metal. It'll sharpen up, you can use it, but once you sharpen it past that first few millimeters, the metal becomes wonderful. And that's about true for just about all these tools. Now, another thing you have to take into consideration is sizing. Pretty much all chisels nowadays are going to be sized on the metric scale, which means for a half-inch chisel, sometimes they would use 12 millimeters, sometimes they will use 13 millimeters, and they will call it a half-inch. You gotta understand, most of these manufacturers are making stuff for the world market, and most of the world market does use metric. I personally love metrics for big measurements, but for most things human size, I do think, like furniture, that having the ratios of our imperial system is a lot better and a lot simpler. Anyways, what that means is this is not a true half millimeter. So if you're like me and you use your tools to do measurements, if I'm knocking out an inch, I will just walk my chisel over an inch. If you're using a metric tool that approximates a half inch, and then you go grab a ruler that is a true inch, you will find your joints don't fit together. One thing I like about this company is they do have a brand of these chisels, a model of these chisels that is a true imperial size. And that made a world of difference. I didn't realize how much I depended upon my tool sizing for my measurement until I got into these chisels. Now, I will say this. Whenever we relocated to Austin, I bought myself one little luxury tool to kind of celebrate the move. I bought me basically a Bugatti of a chisel world. Highly, I'm not going to say overpriced, but very, very expensive. I love this chisel, and I want you to look at the side bolster on the side. There is none. There is no flat on the side at all. It is almost an edge unto itself. In fact, I had to take sandpaper to knock down the sharpness because I kept cutting my fingers when I was sliding into joints. Love it. This is also that powdered metal stuff I was talking about. Quite pricey nowadays, but really does hold its edge well. I just love the shape of this blade. The low bolster on the side, how it tapers up in the middle. Everything about the shape is something I like. So in conclusion, I think you need to look for a chisel that is the true measurement that you're going to be using. If you're sticking with millimeters, most all chisels will be okay. If you want to use true imperials and you want to use an imperial ruler, I would stick to tools that are truly imperial sized. Second thing is the bolsters on the side. I want to get something as narrow and uniform all the way down as possible. And there are a few brands of chisels out there like that, but they aren't as many as you would think. And once again, you want a good look for good steel. Most chisels are going to have some amount of chrome vanadium in nowadays. It's just a marketing thing to keep them nice and shiny. But some manufacturers put so little in there that you can't really call it a chrome manganese steel because of that. Chrome vanadium steel because of that. This is nowhere close to stainless steel, where some of the other chisels are really pretty much stainless steel. So now that we've discussed chisel shape and the steel, let's get back to carving. So how are you liking your symbol so far? I would tell you a lot of students will take it from here and say, ooh, I like that, I'm done. Put a coat of paint on the background, color the front, cut it to size, and call it quits. And that's perfectly okay. But if you want to learn a little bit more, stick around. How many of y'all, when you were planing the bottom, figured out that as long as you were going deeper, you were always going with the grain, you were laying the fibers down, but you couldn't lift up? Because the moment you lifted up, you were going against the grain, and all of a sudden you got these cracks going on. So you had to come back from the other direction and go down. There's lots of little tricks out there to solve that, but what you experience is what a lot of people experience when they're planing wood or they're sawing or something like that. They have to pay attention to the grain direction. And grain direction goes through the wood, sideways, cornerways, and it is in a curve. All the grain is just wild in wood, and we have to adapt to it. So the final little exercise we want is I like to clean up the edges of my letter and the border. It's all kind of a little bit rough now. Maybe put a slight bevel to round it over, and also that way I don't have to erase the pencil marks. We'll just carve them off. So in this situation, we're going to use a chisel in a little bit different manner. So before we were doing some chopping down, and now we've done some cross grain paring and with the grain paring. Some of y'all have actually experimented with coming down with a bevel up on the triangles on the corners to shoot it down. But now we're going to work on this end grain all along here, and we just want to smooth it out. But we have to take into consideration, once again, grain direction. If I want to smooth out this corner, put a slice of bevel all the way around, I'm going to try a slicing action. But if I start slicing this way, because the grain direction is working this way, all of a sudden it will kick and it will want to split. What I would need to do is come back, so I'm laying those grains down, laying the grain down, and that way I won't get a lot of splitting. Which means that there's going to be a point on the top of this curve where I'm going to have to stop and come from the other direction. There's also going to be a point on this side of the curve where I'm going to have to stop and come, or I can't start there. I have to start a little bit lower, a little bit higher, because there's a spot where the grain reverses. The same on the inside of the corner. Except on the inside of the corner, I'm now going to have to come the opposite way I did on the outside. Once again, so I'm laying the fibers down. Now I found the inside's a little bit easier because I can use the bevel, the bottom angle, to pivot off the corner. So I can actually do a nice roundness by just using that bevel to adjust my curve as I come around. And using pivot points is something that's quite common in woodworking because it gives us leverage. Now a lot of time leverage isn't about power, it's about control. So I will take the bevel down using my front hand to control direction and my back hand to control propulsion, and I will pivot off of that bevel. And notice once I get about right here, it starts to split, so I have to be careful. Then coming up the outside, because I don't have this bevel to pivot around, I will flip it so the bevel's up. And now I'm just going to do a slicing action using my backhand for propulsion, and I'm going to pivot off of my little finger. So the little finger becomes a fulcrum for me to work with. And just carve my way around, adding the slightest of bevels, just to make it look nice. Once I reach this top portion, it starts to split out on me. So now, because of grain direction, I've got to come back. So I'm going to pick a point down here where the grain starts to lay over and start there and do the same exact thing on the outside. And remember, if you make it a little bit worse, there's no reason why you can't just square it up and go straight down again and re-chop it out. Voila. Plus, having that little bevel there will prevent it from, it feels nicer and it's not going to splinter as much. So work your way all the way around, putting a bevel, and then you'll want to do the same on the outside. Just the slightest of bevels. Use the bevel point to give you leverage, to give you control. Same across the top. Notice I'm doing the top at an angle. I'm not approaching it dead on. I'm scraping the angle across to give me a better cut. And I try and keep one hand on the board as a fulcrum or a little brace. Just gives you better control. So while you're doing that, let's finish up our talk about chisels and discuss handle design. Now, once again, my go-to chisel for the better part of a decade was a knockoff of the Irwin Blue Chip, the Marples Blue Chips made by Irwin, the company that bought out Marples. Now, a lot of people do not like this handle because it is plastic, and they say in a lot of use, your hand gets sweaty and stuff like that, and it slips or it creates blisters. I've never had an issue with that. And some people don't like the fact that it is somewhat rounded on the end because they say their mallet deflects off. I've never had a problem with that either. In fact, a lot of people would just take a hacksaw and saw straight across to make it flat. And so many people did that. In the latest version of this Irwin Blue Chip Marples, they've created a new handle shape. Still the same material, still the same color, but it's got a flatness on top. And that's exactly why they did it, because people were cutting the ends of them off. Now, there are other kinds of plastics, something like this high-impact plastic, and supposedly you can hit these with a normal metal hammer, and they will last a lifetime. I just kind of think they feel a bit weird, and I don't particularly like the shape of this one. It feels a little bit too big. Now, you will see a lot of hammers that have metal on the end, and these are more carpentry style hammers. These are designed so that you can hit them with a claw hammer. Personally, to me, that seems kind of scary because a claw hammer, even the big ones, they've got a small thing, so you have to be a little bit more accurate. I like the big carving mallets and the big joiner mallets because if I miss a little bit, I'm not going to hit my hand. Anyways, that's what those are designed for. Now, I will tell you, the ones I bought for the school, even before I bought them, I hated the handles. I don't particularly like the shape. It doesn't fit my hand very well. I really had to hold on to it to grip it. And the fact that they got this little metal on the end kind of tells you that they used a fairly cheap wood, because most furniture makers are not going to be whacking this thing hard enough to split the wood. And even if they did, they're furniture makers. They can make a new handle. They put metal on the end to prevent it from splitting, as the end wood is just decimated by mallet strikes. Now, Japanese chisels do that all the time, but the Japanese generally use a small metal hammer versus what we use in this country is mainly wood hammers most of the time, or rubber hammers. So they do that one because the mallet material is quite a bit harder than the wood, so it does deform a little bit. Now, you also have two other main styles of handles. One are what they call tang base, where the chisel has a tang that runs straight down the mallet, and you drill a hole in this wood and then slide the tang in there, and it seats it pretty well. Most of the time when you see that kind of mallet, you're going to have a little metal ferrule right there to prevent the wood from splitting whenever you drive the chisel home into that one, because it is a bit of a wedging action. The other style is socket style. Now, I need to tell you up front, I'm not a big fan of socket styles. Most professional woodworkers, there's a set of chisels out there that are based on socket styles. They're a knockoff of the old Stanley 750s. People rant and rave on them all the time. I've just never jumped on the bandwagon or whatnot about them. Socket styles are basically, you have a chisel and the handle is loose. It's not permanently anchored on here. And you find a lot of people that will buy these that will either super glue or use hairspray or something to actually chemically induce a bond to keep that handle in there. Because wood is constantly moving, this diameter changes. So if you just set it here, the handle will loosen up. The idea is you bang it and it drives it down. The problem is it doesn't always drive it down. It doesn't always anchor all the time. In fact, I've had a couple of these where even in use where I'm hitting it, you would think that would be driving the handle down, they just pop up. And you can never hang this on your tool rack like that, because in the middle of the night you're going to hear it clang, clang, clang as the blade falls off of that the socket, and you chip the bottom on the metal and you have to resharpen your whole chisel. You can hang it here, that's okay. The big advantage that people tell me is that it's so easy to swap out your handles. A few taps, there you go. So you could have multiple size handles for each chisel. So if you're doing a lot of paring, you can get a longer handle to give you more leverage. The thing is, I always ask people that have these kind, well, how many handles do you have for your chisel? And they tell me one. Kind of defeats the purpose. The other thing that people say is the handles themselves are very easy to make. All you have to do is turn it at a certain angle. So you can make your handles, replacement handles, really, really quickly. My thinking, though, is it's not really that much harder to just drill a hole in a piece of wood and put the tang in. I'm a woodworker. I know how to drill holes. The other disadvantage I see in the sockets comes when you get into the bigger sizes of chisels. I have a very well-known high-end chisel company that I bought a 1/10 inch chisel because they were the only ones that made it at the time, and I need this for a specific task. I love this chisel. It is a socket chisel. Has that little wood right here, and it will seat very well. It stays in there pretty good, but I can pull it out. Well, not today, it's kind of humid. It seats pretty well, but with a quick sideways tap, you can get the handle out. The problem with these is look at that handle diameter. The part of the wood that's in the socket, it's not very big. So, just to show you that even the high-end companies can make something that isn't of good use to you. You would think it. This right here is the most expensive chisel I've ever bought. It is a 1/2 inch mortising chisel. The way I use a mortising chisel, I end up leveraging quite a bit. So when you have that little piece of wood, I mean, just a little piece of wood here that you are leveraging quite a bit of pressure on, guess what happens? They break. This is like the third one I've had. 2 of them I actually bought directly from the company. One I made, and they just can't take the abuse that I put on a 1/2 inch chisel. Whereas a socket style, because they generally have the metal ferrule and the long tang that goes up in them, there's not as much pressure on each part of the wood, so they tend to do a little bit better. So even the high-end companies, depending upon how you use them, they might not be the best choice. I will tell you, the metal, the machining, the finishing on this thing is wonderful, but it doesn't make a very good 1/2 inch chisel for me. Now, the last thing I hope will save you a little bit of money. Do you need to buy a full set of chisels? I'm here to tell you here and now, no. I never realized how much I depended upon one chisel when I was using this blue chip, because the plastic never showed any wear and tear. Well, I bought a full set of these chisels right here, all 11 sizes, to test them out about 2 years ago, and I used them consistently for 1 year. So I'm going to show you a picture of the entire set, and you tell me which one of these chisels was in my hand 95% of the time. I'll give you a hint. It's the only one that's mushroomed on the handle. The 1/2-inch chisel. I use it all the time. Reason being, if I use one chisel, I only have to keep this one sharp most of the time. I do typically use one small chisel, like a 1/4 inch occasionally for cutting in 1/4 inch grooves. And every now and then having one larger chisel, like 1 inch or 1.5 inches, is a luxury. But most all the work I do, I get away with one chisel, which is why when I treated myself, I only bought one luxury chisel, that 1/2 incher that stays in the corner of my bench the entire time. Now, when I bought chisels for the school, I did go ahead and buy a set of 4. You know, the 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1 inch. And in the 2 years we've been here, which chisel do you think we use with most classes? I don't think any of my students have used the 1 inchers yet. Maybe 1 or 2. We've used a 1/4 incher for grooving, but most of the time they have a 1/2 inch in their hand. In fact, I leave the 1/2 inchers out here all the time. They just come over and grab them. So just get yourself one good chisel, tune it up very well, use that chisel until you need another side. And invariably, when that situation comes, you'll figure a workaround where you don't actually have to get the other sides. So I hope this discussion has given you a little bit of ammunition to go out and do a little research. A good chisel is not a big investment. I want to say these were about $13 or $15. This will last my lifetime. I did buy one luxury one, which that's what I'm using, so this is kind of my backup right now. But a good chisel, I mean, you'll pass it on for generations. You're not going to wear it out. You can sharpen it, you can abuse it. Yeah, go for it. So I suggest just doing a little bit of research because you're going to be living with it for a while. What I typically find, though, is a lot of people will buy a full set of chisels that they think they can afford. And when you get the full set, you're spending the same amount of money on each one. So if you get a $70 set of 12 chisels, basically you're spending less than $10 per chisel. How good a chisel do you think you're going to be getting at that price point? Granted, these are only $13 to $15, but that little extra money does make a big difference. And even the ultra luxury premium chisels that are going for like $60 to $90, that's still less than a lot of chef knives. And there's seemingly a lot more engineering going into these things than chef knives. So, I mean, I don't feel bad about buying a luxury one. And if you have the money, you will really appreciate it. There are a couple of high-end manufacturers out there. I've given you enough information that you can take their marketing literature, look at the metal, look at pictures of the shape, look at their measurements, look at their handle design, and make a good, qualified, educated decision on what you want to buy. So let's get back to the woodworking. Well, there we go. A finished carved, recessed carved symbol, a letter G. I mean, this thing isn't going to be perfect. We were using actually the wrong tools for doing this kind of recessed carving, but it gave us a good experience in interacting with the wood and dealing with grain direction, which was the overall point for this. All that's really left to do is to cut the ends off of it, and if you wanted to, you might be able to sand a few of your little minor blemishes out. No big deal. Some people enjoy painting it and then running a roller over it so you get 2 different colors over here, or you can just put it in the trash. It's entirely up to you. What we got out of it was the experience and the knowledge. The little product wasn't that big a deal. In our next episode, we're going to do part 3, the final of this introductory woodworking episode, and we're going to use all the same tools, all the same clamps that you use, but we're going to add one item. We're going to add a square and a ruler because we're going to use precise measurements to make some cuts. And using just the chisel and mallet, I'm going to introduce you to some basic joinery techniques to do that one. The material you're going to be using is getting a 3-inch by 7-inch board, and it can be the same 3/4 material. That's not as important, but the size is pretty important. So come to the next lesson, the next episode, with your materials ready. I hope you enjoyed this video and were able to take away a new little nugget of information that will benefit your woodworking. I enjoy teaching, which is why I cashed in my retirement and savings to open up this little woodworking school for teens and adults. But good intentions alone won't keep the school alive. We need help from individuals like you. So if you got a little information from this video, I hope you'll like and share it online and maybe subscribe to the channel. And if you think more videos like this would be beneficial to you and others, maybe visiting our website. On our support page, there's other ways you can help support the school. And I want you to remember one last thing. It is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Y'all be safe and have fun. What? Did you think I was going to let you go without assigning you homework? Here it is. What would be the potential danger, based upon what we discussed today on metallurgy and chisel design and stuff like that, of sharpening a chisel on a power grinder? Leave your answer in the comments below.